afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody. Here we go. Welcome to part 2 of the Folk Voice Conference. Now,
you're muted, Steve.
Unmute yourself.
Martin did that. He shut me up. I forgot where I was. It's all gone wrong already because Katie Ryder, who was going to be on second, can't make it because she's not well. So we will hear from Katie, I hope, at one of our ordinary Zoom meetings in June. But that means we only have the 3 papers, and we've changed the order that they're in, and I've forgotten what order it is, but that's all right because Sue will be chairing. Sue Allen is kindly chairing this time. So I've just got to say, don't forget to join us again next Sunday, which is the 2nd of May, for the last 4 papers for this conference. And then 2 weeks after that, we're back to our normal fortnightly routine. As usual for this conference, we're taking questions at the end of each paper rather than leaving them till the end. And as always, if you want to say something, raise your hand by clicking on reactions down the bottom, or if you're using an old version of Zoom, it's under participants. But if you are using an old version of Zoom, please update it as soon as you know, by the next meeting, because it confuses everybody. So without further ado, we're going to hand over to Sue, who's going to chair the rest of the session for us. Hi, Sue.
Hi, Steve. Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody to this second of the Folk Voice Conference with 3 speakers, as Steve says, and I do know which order they're in, fortunately. So can I just add to Steve's note about raising your hand under reactions, that it's also up to you to lower your hand at the same place, because it's confusing if you leave your hand up. It looks like you've another question. Anyway, the first person that I'm happy to introduce today is Paul Mansfield. I found a link in all the talks today. As Steve says, we don't set a link, but we often find one. And I think the link today is more unorthodox perspectives, more unorthodox singers and settings for singers. And Paul is going to talk about voicing traditional song in non-specialist settings. So that very much fits that bill. He's a singer himself, as well as a writer on folk topics for the living tradition, amongst other things. So I believe he's got a PowerPoint, so it's over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Sue. I shall now share my screen, hopefully.
Good.
Can you see that, Sue?
I can just see it says you've started screen sharing.
I see.
It hasn't shown me what you're sharing.
Ah.
You need your PowerPoint.
Right, okay.
Oh, there it is.
I can see it now, can you? I just had a Zoom quit unexpectedly notice come up.
Well, it hasn't quit. You're still there. Your PowerPoint's there, but we just need to see it on the slides. Oh, we've lost. Have we lost Paul? I've gone back to Martin. Does that mean we've lost Paul? Was it Paul that was saying he might cut out?
Hello,
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, there you are. Hello. Back.
And can you see my screen?
I can't. I can just see you.
Ah, very strange.
You froze for a moment and then disappeared.
Right, okay, but you can't see my screen.
No. Does it say you're sharing at your end?
Let me just...
Go to share screen and click on the PowerPoint.
do that again. How's that?
There you go. Wonderful. That's
Great.
it.
Right, okay. It's going to be one of those weeks, isn't it? People were not able to be with us because they're unwell, the order changing, technical problems. It's all going terrifically. Right, okay, so I shall move on at a pace now. So I'm talking about singing songs in what I call broader acoustic music contexts. So this is not a literature-based paper. This is a paper based on the experiences and views of singers who sing in folk clubs, but who also sing elsewhere or have tried to sing elsewhere. So, okay. And now my, whoops. Right, okay. So the topic, the assumptions I'm making with this topic is other folk clubs have been an important performance setting for folk music. And if Nick had been on before me, I'd have said, and I don't need to say that they're not the only places in which traditional songs are sung. But Nick hasn't been on, so I shall say they're not the only places in which traditional songs are sung. And I've got this idea, perhaps tenuous idea, of protected environments, and that has a positive and a negative connotation. So the negative connotation of folk clubs being a protected environment for folk song would be that traditional songs are safe in folk clubs, and they're not safe elsewhere in the sense they're not necessarily welcome repertoire. So that would be a negative way of looking at club as a protected environment. The positive way of looking at it would be this is where you go to hear traditional songs first, perhaps. It's where you learn songs, it's where you learn repertoire, you develop your own style, you develop your own version, and so on. So there are various ways in which we could look at the links between the folk clubs and the broader tradition. And I think that's a topic that could be explored in a number of ways. But today, I'm looking particularly at singers who sing in clubs, but have also taken the music outside. And the reason I've got a little image of a key in the lock there is I start with the assumption that it would be a great shame if folk clubs were the only place that you ever did hear traditional music. So, as I say, it's not an academic literature-based piece. It's based on a limited number of conversations in one part of the English East Midlands. So if you're not familiar with the English East Midlands, here's a map. And you can see in the middle of the screen, Derby, Nottingham and Leicester. And my area of operation is basically at the top of that triangle. We used to live between Derby and Nottingham and now live north of Derby. So that's a geographical setting. And the prompt for the article is a particular experience I had just over a year ago in an event that was labelled an acoustic session. So I sang Lass of London City, or White Copper Alley, as many of you might know it. And this prompted a few comments, including from the young woman sitting next to me with her cello, saying, things have got a bit weird. And that comment in turn prompted another few comments of a mainly humorous nature about my choice of song. So that kind of got me thinking. And I guess that what you might be thinking is, what kind of idiot thinks that a song that involves prostitution and the anti-hero implicitly fading away from syphilis or similar at the end of the song was a good idea to sing in that kind of session anyway? And of course you could be right, but I think the reaction to it in some ways is representative of the reaction I've had to singing traditional songs at other times in these sorts of settings. So it wasn't the first time I'd sung there. There was one other person in the session singing traditional material, but he was accompanying himself with a guitar. I was the only unaccompanied singer. So it's not always obvious from the way that sessions, musical events describe themselves, what kind of music is standard for that event, what kind of music is welcome there. And if I can just do a quick plug for the article that I wrote with Faye Heald, Anything Goes, in Ethnomusicology Forum, I did write a section in that going into that issue about how clubs and sessions describe themselves in a bit more detail. So if you want to read more about that, you can look at that, that article. Right, so I'm now going to go on to the quotes from the people I've spoken to. So this is my main positive example, I think, a singer who has taken traditional music into family occasions, family do's, as we would say in England. And he says that I would go for songs that have a good chorus, good tunes, not too complicated, songs of the locality, humorous songs, well-known sea songs or shanties. Good old drinking songs and tongue twisters would be the sort of thing I would opt for. So the emphasis here is on the choice of song for the occasion. But of course, knowing this individual, I also know that this is a strong singer, someone who would be a very credible performer. And I guess over a period of years, he would be known within his extended family as someone who does sing. So even with that particular selection of songs, it might not be so easy for somebody else who was trying it for the first time, or somebody who's perhaps a less strong singer, a point we will come back to. So my second slide sounds a more cautionary note. I always equate singing folk songs, whether traditional or not, in a non-folk environment, with those street preachers who are foisting their beliefs on you, whether you want them or not, and leaving themselves wide open to ridicule. If I want to listen to a sermon, then I'll go to church. The same as if I want folk song, I'll go to a folk club, festival, or concert. So there's a choice here of associating folk music, listening to it, or performing it in a particular range of events. And this is really based for this individual on past experiences, where some in some events that they've attended or sung at, traditional music and contemporary folk have sat well together, or possibly with blues or country music, but in other events where there's those kinds of mixtures, they haven't sat comfortably well together. So you make a choice about whether you want to expose yourself to that level of discomfort, so to speak. So this is something about fitting in with the event. And one of the other people I spoke to said that her view was that traditional song was usually received politely. So I asked her, well, what do you mean by received politely? And on the screen here is what she said. My impression is the underlying feeling is it's not really our thing, but thank you anyway. There's also the encouraging comment when you perform something which is more in line with their preferences. If you want your performance to be liked, you fit in with the general tone of the event. It's down to whether you want to be a missionary or just a singer. So we've got the religious analogy there as well. But the point here is there's something about what kind of reception you expect, or what kind of reception you enjoy, so to speak. Some people want to be liked. I know some people who will go and sing the song they want to sing wherever, irrespective of whether people like it or not. So there's a kind of difference between individuals in that respect. There's also, of course, the question of the quality of the singing. Now, this particular quote is referring to singing in folk clubs, but I think it also refers to the quality issue when you take the music outside of folk clubs. Some local performers are good, but most of us, to be honest, are pretty mediocre, and some are excruciatingly bad. I wouldn't take a visiting acquaintance who wasn't a folkie to a folk club, except maybe if they were an anthropologist. It would be too embarrassing for both of us. And there's my little image of somebody taking notes. So it's either the anthropologist with his or her field notes, or it's somebody marking the singers out of 10. Now, one of the most interesting aspects, I think, is gender. And this, I think, is a particularly interesting point. So my participant here said, I think it's very different if you're a woman. In pubs, I can get away with singing a folk song and people say, oh, listen to that woman singing that pretty song. If a man gets up and sings a folk song, he might be more likely to be accused of being weird, or you haven't got a beard or sandals on. What are you doing singing folk songs? That kind of thing. Now, I'm not sure how consciously the phrase "I can get away with singing a folk song" was used in the context of the conversation we were having. I did wonder whether there was this this association of woman and pretty song, how well that kind of stood up, whether it implied that the song had to be melodic, romantic. But I revisited the audio of the interview this morning, and in fact, it was stated you could have a pretty song, but with quite dark content. So I suppose the question there is, or there's another aspect there, is whether people listen to the tune or whether they listen to the melody. But there's really quite a lot in that particular quote, and quite a lot to explore in gender, I think. So my final theme is about the venues in which these things take place. So I was talking to the organisers of the particular session that's pictured here, and they said the arrival of real ale pubs and microbreweries makes your audience select in a certain way. There's something about the sort of people who go to micro pubs that's more compatible with folk music. They are more traditional in their outlook. So this is quite a small pub. If you can see the image, okay, there's probably on the side where the picture's been taken, there would have probably been about another 10 people who you can't see. I would guess that most of the people sitting down actually came for the music. The people standing up, not so. It's a micro pub that is frequently used for live music, a number of nights a week. So it's no surprise if you walk in and there's live music going on. And for this particular session, the organisers had tried to, in their own words, make it more folky by inviting people like myself who sing traditional music and sing unaccompanied. And it is the sort of venue where it's possible on some days to sing an unaccompanied song and you can hear a pin drop, so to speak. Doesn't always work, it depends who's in the pub. There was one occasion in which this session followed on from a lunchtime whiskey tasting, and the customers for the whiskey tasting were still in the pub, and by this stage they were, so to speak, well watered, and it was really quite difficult to get a non-amplified session going. So just to finish off with some themes then, my attempt to quickly summarise. I've got 6 boxes here. Number 1, the setting, the purpose of the event and the type of environment. Number 2, who are the participants and what might be their expectations. Number 3, beliefs and stereotypes about folk music and traditional song. And of course, those ideas could be in the head of the performer, although it's quite reasonable for people to be anxious about how traditional song might be received if they've had bad experiences before. Number 4, gender. I'd also add in age as a dimension. I've not explored that here, but it would be possible to explore it. Number 5, the singer's confidence in the song and their own singing. And number 6, the quality of the repertoire and the performance. Is this a singer who only their mother or an anthropologist could love? So the quality issue is definitely there. And I think if I was writing this out in full and extending this, I would probably be looking for a combination of the event and the venue on one side, and the singer and the song on the other. I think that's the way that I would extend that and try and build more relationships between the different factors. Today, I've just been illustrating some people's views about that. So I've belted through that at a pace because we had a slightly stuttering start. The last thing I want to say really is that I would be delighted to get comments from people's who are here today and their own views on the matter. So on this screen, I've got an internet address, Paul LT feedback@btinternet.com. It's the address I use for some of my Living Tradition magazine purposes, which is why it's got the LT in the middle. So Paul LT feedback@btinternet.com, and I will put that in the chat at some point later on as well. So it just remains for me to say thank you for listening.
And thank you very much indeed, Paul. Do you know, I think a voice that only their mother or an anthropologist could love. We all know somebody like that, don't we? But lots of food for thought, as I say, and lots of questions I think will come out of that. And if I could, I'm going to have to try and scan all these screens now and see if anybody's got their hands up. I can see Marge's iPhone has a question up. You've got a hand raised, Marge.
Yes, hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. There are so many layers here, and you could write a book, never mind a 20-minute presentation. Certainly, as you know, I did field work in a community where the term quote unquote traditional or quote unquote folk song was meaningless. I mean, a good quote unquote a good song was a good song, and people, Philip McDermott did not distinguish between how can you buy Killarney and Rush's Green. So you get into questions of aesthetics, you know, what is important to a singer and his or her audience? Is it the tune? Is it the story, which certainly I found in my field work, and even quality, quote unquote quality of song, quality of singer. Aesthetic preferences can be pretty variable depending on the venues that you are exploring and what people have been exposed to. But I just want to say that you have unpacked so many layers in this presentation, and I hope that you will unpack them some more, perhaps in an article or even a monograph. And I am actually both a singer and one of those anthropologists, so I'm both. Okay, I'll shut up.
Yeah, thank you, Marge. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think this question about the meaningfulness of genre is always there. Certainly, I think now, perhaps more than 50 years ago or 80 years ago, we accept that the dividing line between folk, traditional folk, and music hall, which is the thing that John's talking about later. You know, I think that's accepted. That's a much more porous divide than people originally thought. And certainly I sing songs from the repertoires of people like Harry Upton that would fit more into the music hall category, but I feel I'm doing traditional music when I'm doing that because they were traditional singers. Well, that's the way I look at it anyway. But thanks, Marge.
Great, thank you. I can't see another hand at the moment. I have scanned the screens. I've just got a quick question, if you don't mind, Paul. You mentioned about the people going to microbreweries somehow being more open to having folk song as entertainment. But I wonder, and it was you missed it off your grid at the end. Was it not to do with them being more middle class? Does class not come into it?
Class may come into it, but I think I would suggest that the association with class is actually more the association of the music with class than it is with the type of pub and class. I mean, you'd have to kind of get some empirical evidence on that, but certainly I would say that depending on where the micro pub is, you know, what sort of town it's in and what the local competition is, the other pubs, I would say that there are plenty of micro pubs that have a broad social customer base.
There's one more hand up. This will be the last. Oh no, my goodness, a flock of other hands now. Karen, I think you were the next person with your hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted quickly to comment that in my community in Toronto, traditional unaccompanied ballads are welcomed in storytelling situations. That's it.
Do you want to respond to that, Paul?
Yeah, well, I think that there's certainly an overlap between traditional folk and storytelling in this country too. I'm not familiar enough with the storytelling community to say how extensive that is, though.
Okay, that's fine. Irene, I think I'll take you next and then Brian. Irene Shettle, if you can unmute. Thank you. She's
Yeah, so I
trying.
was only really, yeah, it was only a quick one, really. You, in your table of considerations, you've got purpose of event, type of environment. Had you actually done any considerations of the musical experience of the listeners? In the past, I've actually sung in front of classical singers at soirees we had at the end of a week of training, and found that they were quite receptive. They weren't familiar with folk songs, but they wanted to ask an awful lot of questions afterwards. But I didn't find anybody that was against the idea of listening to a tragic ballad, for argument's sake.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because that's a very particular sort of audience, isn't it?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I guess I was perhaps in my mind, my main comparison was with the sort of bordering on an open mic type of mixed popular genre events in pubs. But you're quite right. I mean, the audience experience, and particularly the assumptions and prior experiences that people bring, I think you can say a lot about music from the point of view of the audience. So
I have to say, it was quite a broad experience. So we'd got barbershop singers, we'd got classical singers, we had people who didn't sing very much at all. But I found it intriguing because I was doing the missionary zeal thing as well. This is your English music, you ought to listen to it. But they actually were quite stunned, shall I say, sometimes. It wasn't something they were used to, but they actually quite enjoyed it. So the musical experience, I think, and enjoying singing, no matter what sort, seemed to be feeding their reaction.
Right.
We've got two more questions. That'll have to be it. If you can keep them brief. First of all, Brian.
Hello, and firstly making a quick observation that I think unaccompanied singing in an environment like a pub is a much harder sell than turning up with a guitar or even another instrument. And I just think people are so unaccustomed to the sound of the unaccompanied voice that you're quite a brave person if you want to go and do that in a pub. But my actual question was to Paul was, are you making a distinction between a single person setting up shop in a public space and then trying to grab the attention of the uncommitted punters who are sitting around, or and between that and a group of you arriving to basically perform to one another with what you hope is the tolerance and possibly the attention of the crowd in that bar room or wherever?
Yes, thanks, Brian. Yeah, it was the latter. Both the session in which I had the Lass of London City experience and the micro pub that I showed at the end are non-advertised events, but they are regular, and a number of people turn up as a group. At the micro pub in Derby, the latter one, that the group that kind of constitutes the largest proportion of the people in the pub. The other one, where I had the experience 14 months ago, is more a group of you sit in the corner. Again, it's one bar, and I think the whole issue about doing it in a single bar environment as opposed to behind the door in a folk club is another kind of interesting angle on it.
Yes, fair enough.
Thanks. And we're going to have to keep moving on. Tina McKevitt, you've got a question. Can you keep it brief and a brief answer from Paul? Thank you.
Yes, well, it continues Brian's point, really, but I wondered if you got the impression, Paul, that people are uncomfortable these days with unaccompanied singing and that they automatically equate it with lack of skill, lack of accomplishment, something that's going to be boring, and just don't listen or aren't prepared to listen. Whereas, as Brian says, if somebody's got an instrument, their attention is more grabbed and they think they're more skilled. I just wondered if you can.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely more, people are definitely more familiar with guitar accompaniment. I think, though, if people have come to an event to hear songs, they're more sympathetic to whether you're accompanied or unaccompanied. So it depends who's in the venue, really, Tina, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there for you. But once again, thank you very much. Very thought-provoking, and we hope you'll write about this and speak about this again. Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
Moving on rapidly, we're already 5 minutes late, but we did start a couple of minutes late initially. If we can move on to John Baxter, who's quite familiar to people both on the Sunday traditional song forums and on the email group list, as he's the sort of fount of all knowledge on things music hall, and is given help to quite a number of us, and he's going to enlighten us further this afternoon. John, over to you. We're seeing your screen. We just need to show you slides. Your first slide.
Can you see it now?
We're seeing the whole thing. We haven't got the slideshow.
Okay. Have you got the slideshow now? It should be.
No. Have you clicked on slideshow? I can see it's underlined. Start show. Start show. Play it from the beginning. Yes.
That's what I've clicked. Have you got anything yet?
It's still showing the overall PowerPoint.
Right.
John,
Okay.
John, I'd suggest you go out of share and try again.
Thank you, Martin.
La 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 la.
Talk amongst yourselves, everyone.
I do apologise for this. You wouldn't believe I do this every day, would you?
A number of technical problems today, it has to be said. There's obviously something in the air. We're not used to this hot weather in April. It must be that's doing it. But, you know, we could see your screen. It was just the actual slideshow wasn't starting. Martin obviously knows a thing or two about this. Right.
So are you seeing it now?
The whole thing. We're not seeing the slideshow from the beginning. You have clicked on that?
Yeah, I have. There's something about me having two screens, which works wonderfully normally, but
I mean, we can work with that. It's
okay,
not ideal, but we can work with it. Do you think that would be the best way, Martin?
Yeah.
Big enough for most of us to see.
Okay. Well, I'll work with it now. Apologies for the clumsy title, which reflects that I didn't know what I was going to say when I started writing the proposal for the conference. I'm going to flick quite quickly through some preliminary slides which sort of set out how I've done the work and some of the limitations I've placed on it. I will be making the presentation available for anyone that wants it afterwards, if you want to sort of challenge my methodology or some of my underlying ideas. So the period that I'm focusing on really starts with the tavern concert rooms in the 1820s, well, perhaps in the 1830s more, up to about 1920. I'm looking at music hall songs from that period, and I'm also, one of my underlying ideas or understandings is that really the edges of different types of songs in that period are quite fuzzy. Songs were written for the halls, popular songs were written for the music halls, there were minstrel songs, and there were drawing room ballads, and there is an overlap between all of them, but the bias in the published record, which I've been examining, is very much towards the respectable end of things. So the music hall songs that we know about, particularly from the earliest period, tend to be ones which were at the more respectable end of things, because they were then published as sheet music, which cost money and needed to have a market, either in the middle classes or better off elements of the working class later in the 19th century. So that's an underlying bias that we need to be aware of. I started a project looking at, which I should have started with. I've been working for the last year and a half, 2 years, on looking at music hall songs that have passed into the what you might call the folk song tradition. And very quickly I worked out that in order to make any sense of it at all, I needed to work within Steve Roud's index. So it's very much a sub-project of that general area of understanding, you could call it. Say that I'm working within Steve Roud's paradigm, if you want to be particularly academic. The work that I've done looks quite quantitative in that I've used spreadsheets, but it is really, it relies on some quite qualitative judgments, as you'll see in a minute. And there is a danger that in all the work I do, I end up just reinforcing what we already know, and underlining work that's already been done by Steve Roud, Steve Gardam, and I would say John House and others in this area about the relationship of musical and folk songs. I did also do some work on looking at how people classified musical songs from other angles. I'm not going to go into too much, but generally how people classify songs from the musical reflects on what they're trying to do. If they are looking for some songs that are fun to sing or to know about, they classify them according to things like policemen, songs about horse cabs, and so on. But in the 1970s and 80s, there were some quite serious writers that wanted to look at the social history of the music hall, and they tended to do things like look for songs which reflected the changing role of women in Victorian society. Or Dave Russell is a writer that looked at patriotic song in the music hall and found a lot of them and discussed how and to what extent they influenced working class thinking or reflected the ideas of working class people. Dagmar Kift is someone that did a more complete attempt at classifying music hall songs. I won't go into any detail on that because otherwise I won't have time to talk on later things. These are the classifications I've used, and I should say from the very beginning that if I used contemporary definitions from the Victorian times of what a comic song is, then all these songs would be comic songs because they were sung by comics, and that's how they tended to classify songs when they classified them at all. They might be called serio-comic songs, reflecting the fact that the singer would sing a combination of serious and comic songs. So I didn't think that was particularly useful, so I tried to look for songs that would be seen as being humorous or comic in today's terms when I examined my sample. And these were the classifications I looked at. Things like motto songs. There was a real trend within music hall to have these songs that sort of, on the surface at least, preach to the audience about how they should live their lives. There was a tendency to have songs which reflected a romanticization of country life, which I've called bucolic songs. There were swagger songs like Champagne Charlie, which were when a performer would sing something about how great they were or how much they drink or their lifestyle, sort of songs that involve showing off, which was one theme within music hall songs. I won't go into any more detail on that. I shall just skip on. So I've looked at in detail 220 songs, which between them have 1.6% of the entries in the Roud Folk Song Index. That's issue 119 for the real nerds. And it's 2.2% of the just over 10,000 songs that have been classed in the Roud Folk Song Index. And I have not looked at, I've tried to be quite strict about just looking at songs that I know were written for the music hall stage or the tavern concert room stage, which is what came immediately before the music hall. So I was very disappointed, for example, not to be able to write about All the Little Chickens in the Garden, which is also known as Treat My Daughter Kindly, which was written by an African-American performer resident in Britain, but may have only been performed as part of minstrel shows rather than music hall. So whilst I've written about that on my website, I haven't included that in this analysis. So that's just an example. In terms of how I chose the 220 songs, I did spend quite a lot of time looking at some particularly prolific authors, Weston and Lee, for example, G.W. Hunt, Harry Clifton, J.B. Gagan, and others. I've talked about Harry Clifton and J.B. Gagan and some of the other authors in earlier talks for the Song Forum. And that meant that I was, to identify songs by them, I went through all the 1,600 or so songs that those 808 authors wrote and looked for them within the song index. So it was reverse searching, if you like. And this is a snapshot of my underlying spreadsheet. And if you look closely, you'll probably find things you disagree with. So my judgments as to whether a song was comic or not. For example, I didn't think that Jim the Carter Lad was a particularly comic song, but I did think it might be classified as bucolic in that it might reflect a romanticization of country life. You'll see the other thing that I've looked for, if you look closely, is I've counted the number of discrete source singers, the number of different singers that a song has been collected from, to try and see which songs have had a bigger impact in the oral tradition. And I'll come back to that later, because that does, as an underlying piece of data, that does have an effect on some of what we see. Okay, what else did I want to say about that? Okay. Well, some headlines. I would guesstimate that at least 5% of the songs in the Rowd Folk Song Index were written for the musical stage. I would say at least 5% and probably not more than 10%, but I don't really know. But there we go, that's my guesstimate. 75% of the songs, which means that 25% of them, on my scheme of things, were not comic songs. So my initial prejudices when I started all those years ago was that most musical songs were broadly humorous, and at least 1 in 4 of them, at least in the way they're sung today, are probably not seen as being humorous. Because someone asked the question when I was starting this research about how many folk songs are in the first person, I was able to look at the whole Rowd Folk Song Index, all 10,000 songs, and count the number of songs which had I, me, we, and so on. Sorry, I, me, and so on, to make them that were first person in the title of the first line. And I've shown that 63% of my songs in my music hall derived song sample start in the first person, whereas 31% in the overall Rowd Folk Song Index start in the first person. I'm not sure what that tells us, except that when someone's singing on the stage, they're more likely to start from singing about themselves. And unsurprisingly, almost all of the songs have a very strong chorus or refrain, because of the nature of the singing in music halls involved audience participation. So these are the broad results. I think if you can understand, this graph shows the different themes of songs and which ones featured most heavily in my 220 song sample. You'll see that songs about love really come towards the bottom of that graph, which means they're most likely to be found in the sample, whereas songs from the music halls that involve mocking the rich and swagger songs, which are actually two overlapping categories, don't feature so much. Okay. But when I cut through the data and look for the songs that were collected most often from source singers, so where songs have been collected from 6 or more source singers, which is the upper quartile for those of you with mathematical leanings, it changes that profile of songs. So if you look at the right-hand graph, that's the upper quartile. That's the songs that have been collected from 6 singers or more. and the balance changes quite a lot. Love is still very important, but swagger songs, songs which mock the rich, disappear almost entirely. Songs of emigration almost double in intensity. I wouldn't want to over-interpret that graph, but I think what's the overall important thing about that is that it changes the balance when you look at the songs that have been collected most often. And the other thing to take into account, if you can understand this graph, it looks at songs from different periods. So the first set of bars on the left show motto songs, mostly come in that orange bar, which is the period 1860 to 1889, which is when motto songs were most popular. So underlying all this is a changing styles in the music hall, and this may be also reflected in what ends up in the folk song index. So there's a lot more thinking to do there. Okay. I promised to end the talk by talking in more about one or two songs that were sung in the music hall that are sung differently today. And I'm backing away from that because I realize we don't really have a good appreciation of how the songs were sung in the music hall in the first place. So I wanted to explore two songs briefly. I'm not sure I'm going to have time to play the recordings because I'm obviously waffled on too much. I will briefly play Pulling Hard Against the Stream.
In this world I gain my knowledge, and for it I've had to pay. Though I haven't been to college, yet I've heard a poet say, life is like a mighty river, flowing on from day to day. Men are vessels launched upon it, sometimes wrecked and cast away. Then do your best in this world.
Sorry about that. What I hope you get from that is this is a song whose words are incredibly preachy, but nonetheless in the right hands, they can be quite moving about taking care of your brother who's been pulling hard against the stream. How did Harry, well, this was a touchstone for motto songs. If you look through, there's a series of adverts down the middle of the screen, which show that in 1867, they published Pulling Hard Against the Stream. And after 1867, he published a series of songs, which were all reporting to be the new Pulling Hard Against the Stream. So they saw this as being his most successful motto song. When he sang it, he didn't dress up, which is what most musical performers generally sang some songs in character. This was a song, if you look at the covers of the sheet music to the side, and if you read contemporary descriptions, Clifton would sing this in his suit, not dressed up as a character. If you remember Mike Yarwood, it would be the equivalent of this is me. Harry Clifton was known as a gentleman performer. I'm not going to try and show this video, which shows an impression of what he might have looked like. He was described as a genial philosopher in a dinner suit. So he was sort of preaching to an audience, but at the same time he was their friend, which I suspect that if he had simply been preaching at the audience, the song wouldn't have been half as popular. There were other professional performers. This is Johnny Patterson, a singer and circus clown who performed in the 1870s and 1880s, and indeed was arguably, there's a story that he died after singing this song to a particularly unhappy audience, but that's another story for another day. He's there playing the Uilleann pipes. But the key thing about this song is how it was taken up in amateur performances. In the 30 years between it being written and the end of the century, there are 62 records of it being performed, often in penny readings organized by churches. These were sort of events which were meant to be entertaining, but at the same time were part of the rational recreation movement, the movement to try and draw people away from the nasty dens of iniquity that were the music halls and other places of entertainment. I'm skirting over that rather quickly, but at the same time, the song with its chorus of taking care of your brother was also very popular amongst friendly societies and early trade unions. Indeed, it turns up in trade union songbooks. And also, you can, if you do a search for the chorus, you'll find it turns up in all sorts of homiletic texts, which means texts that are full of homilies, things like addresses to school assemblies or collections of sermons, and so on. I'm just going to say for 2 minutes, there is a very different type of song which you can't trace through amateur performance, like 10,000 Miles Away, which was originally performed by Harry Liston. I'm not going to play it to you. He did sing this in character. He would be dressed up as a sailor when he sang it. That's the, he sang it lustily and dressed as a sailor.
Cold and stormy.
He wasn't the only one to sing it. Like many successful musical songs, it was transferred into pantomime, which the pantomime Robinson Crusoe. It was made it was sung more famously in America by the great Vivian, who was an expat British performer who had great success over there. This may be too simplistic, but it was then taken to Australia by Billy Emerson, a minstrel performer from America who toured in Australia in 1874, 1875, and he may be responsible for its great popular in America. And it was also revived in the 1880s by J.W. Rowley in Britain. I could only find 6 examples of it performed in amateur performances. So that's not, but what I wanted to do is just probably end by saying there are alternative forms of evidence for the popularity of the song. It occurs in a novel by Walter Besant and James Rice, which is about a novel about Portsmouth, and it describes what is meant to be a music hall from the 1840s. I haven't got time, but the singer gave the chorus with a rich, rollicking baritone, and in a rolling tune was accompanied by a chorus of a couple of hundred throats, which made the windows rattle and the glasses vibrate. Such a chorus, all bawling in unison, I never heard before. When the last bars affectionately clung to by voices to let them go, died away, the illustrious Sam had disappeared, only to emerge again in a new disguise. But that experience of incredibly lusty singing, to me, is exactly how I recall it being sung in sea shanty sessions today. So I'm going to finish there. I think I did have a little bit more to say, but I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. That's so rich. There's so much there. There's so much we needed to see and wasn't quite big enough to see, but you did say you would make the presentation available. Could you put your email again in chat and then people can contact you themselves?
Yeah.
And if you can just stop your screen share and we'll go back.
That should be stopped now.
And I'm going to be very strict and allow just 2 questions, then we can catch up some time before we go on to Nick Dow. So 2 questions, and I'll try and keep an eye on chat, but the preference is to put it in reactions as a hand up. Thank you, Malcolm Barr-Hamilton. Over to you and your question.
Thanks very much, John. That was really interesting. I see you noted that of the songs that have gone into the folk tradition, I think you said 98% of them had choruses. I wonder if there's anything you can say about the tunes of these songs and whether there's anything in common in that respect.
They seem to be relatively simple tunes that are easy to sing. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a particularly good with the dots, but I would say that whenever I've invested in them, the vast majority of them are sung to the same tune that they were sung to in the halls. That's not universally true, but yes, a catchy tune with a good chorus is what. And there is also the case that some of the tunes were nicked from earlier folk songs and earlier songs in general, and not always credited. In fact, quite often not credited.
Thank you, John. And have we any other questions there? Anybody in chat? No. Any more hands? It's so rich, John. I think I will move on if there aren't any more. I see you've put your email address in the chat, so do approach John if you'd like a copy, perhaps as a PDF, yeah, of your PowerPoint, because there's a lot to read there. And I think it's great that you're, what do you say? It's something we obviously all need to do. Working in Steve Roud's paradigm. Well, we all hope to do that, don't we? But so thank you once again, John. Thank you very much. And we'll have to move on. And we move on to Nick Dow, who was originally scheduled to be the beginning of this this afternoon's presentations. Nick is someone else who is also a singer as well as a collector, and I love the title of his presentation, The Secret Stream, because what his speciality has been very often looking at the songs of travellers and looking at travellers singing, and to a lot of us that really is a secret because it's not something we come up to, generally speaking. So, Nick, are you there? Yes, I can.
I'm here, live and in living colour. Yes. Yes, thank you for that, because The Secret Stream is a working title, and I wasn't 100% sure of it, and you've now reassured me to a great deal, Sue. The Secret Stream is indeed a stream of traditional songs that still to this day flow within the community of the travellers. And the reason it is secret is because you have to really be accepted by the travellers to get your fishing rod, as it were, into the stream to glean songs, because they don't sing their songs to just anybody. So what I'm going to do is start off very briefly talking about myself, and I'll make that as brief as possible. And I think Martin has probably got a photograph of myself in a horse and wagon being filmed by Channel 4. I've actually spent decades with the travellers. I'm married to a Romani gypsy whose name is Mally, who's downstairs having her tea. I've learned not only their songs but also their language to a certain degree, but that's another subject which I'll come to later on. I've had some training as a sign writer, and I've learnt the art of gypsy wagon painting, as you can see from that wagon. And really, this is how I became involved, almost involuntarily, in collecting songs. I hasten to add, I don't normally have a horse and wagon outside my house. I actually prefer to go shopping in a car. But this was, I say, especially for Channel 4. Right, well, The Secret Stream is a working title for a 2-volume book on songs collected from the travellers. The first brief for the first book is really to make it a go-to book to see if there's a version from the travelling community of a song that you want to either shown some interest in. So in other words, I'm putting all the songs that I can find sung in the Edwardian Victorian era into one book, and then commenting on those. What I say, I'm not commenting on them. Steve Garden is going to comment on them, and Cohen Braithwaite Kilcoyne is going to set the music. And I will say that the majority of the songs have not been published before. And this has led to some real eye-openers. And that's what I want to share with you this afternoon, about the early collectors and some of the ideas that we have about the travelling community, or more to the point, they had about the travelling community. And I'm going to start with the towering figure of Cecil Sharpe, who we hear lots of stories about as regards his dealings with travellers. And I'm sure you know this particular story, but I'm actually going to read it again. He was in Devon, and he was visiting Priscilla Cooper in Devon. And this is Sharpe's brush with death, as it were, with the travelling community. This is the story as read here. He was noting songs by phonograph from a woman in a caravan, and that's Priscilla Cooper, when suddenly she stopped singing and, turning deathly white, announced that she'd heard her husband approaching. And as he was of a jealous disposition, she was afraid that he would kill Mr. Sharpe. And Mr. Sharpe did not want to be killed. And there was nothing for it but to present a bold face. So, opening the caravan door, he shouted at the man, "A happy Christmas to you. Stop a moment and listen. I've got your wife's voice in a box." And the man was so amazed and delighted, he forgot to kill him, and instead they became great friends. Well, I'm not going to say I don't believe a single word of it, but I don't believe most of it, unfortunately. So excuse me while I cough sceptically. Right, a bit of common sense wouldn't go amiss here. Number one, I happen to know from experience what sort of wagon they were sat in, and it was a big wooden kite wagon, and the door was shut. So unless her husband arrived in a 4x4, he wouldn't actually have heard her coming anyway. But that aside, if Priscilla Cooper had a homicidally jealous husband, it's extremely unlikely she would have let Cecil Sharpe into the caravan in the first place, because she would have been too scared. So what I think actually happened was that no doubt the voice in the box story was true, that Sharpe approached Mr. Cooper and said, "I can get your wife's voice in a box. Please could I go in the caravan and record her?" Which is probably what happened. But it's not as good a story, is it? So neither is it when we look at Sharpe's letter to his wife Constance concerning the meeting with Betsy Holland. Now, to be fair to Sharpe, this was never ever intended for publication, and it wasn't intended to be read out in front of all the people here, but it's going to be. Yesterday, after taking down many songs from Old Parish, he's still in Devon, by the way, we went on to, now he was with the Reverend Francis Etherington, and that's important, on their bikes. We went on to Simmons Bath, where I wrote you. Remember, he's writing to his wife. And we decided to make our way over the moor to Withypool. And we were just wheeling our cycles up the hill when Etherington gave a penny to a very dirty but picturesque little child, who took it and ran to a small cart that was under a tree down a little lane, who gave it to his father, evidently a gypsy. So I went up to him and chatted and broached this question of songs. No, he didn't sing, but his wife did. But she was in a house close by trying to sell some crockery. So we waited, gave him some baccy, played with the second child, which was a baby, tied up in the cart, Presently, out came his wife, Betsy Holland, aged 26, a bright, dark-eyed woman. The baby cooed with delight. Directly she appeared, we attacked her about songs, which she had learned from her grandmother, and with a little persuasion, she sat down on a stone, gave her baby the breast, and then began a murder song. And then he went on to talk about how the singing progressed from there. I've never heard anything like it. I wouldn't imagine that any woman in this day and age would sit in the middle of a road on a seat and do something as intimate as feed her baby and then burst into song after it. Never mind in front of Cecil Sharpe, or I might add, Etherington, who was a man of the cloth. So it really didn't happen. Evelyn V. Clark gave a completely different account of the meeting and suggested Mrs. Cooper was actually sat in a tent when she was approached and came out, and indeed did sing the murder song that Sharpe was referring to. Now, I'm not going to jump on poor old Sharpe. He's been jumped on enough by various different people. Basically, I don't think that Mr. Cecil Sharpe allowed the truth to get in the way of a good story. which last time I looked wasn't actually a hanging offence. So he hasn't actually done any harm by this, but it does put it into perspective. What are we to believe about the approach that Sharpe made to the gypsies, and what are we to believe about other collectors as well? Well, we can find out a little bit about some of the other performers, and not all. About some of the other collectors. Not all of it is, shall we say, something that's to be proud of. Ella Leather. Now, there's a collector. She was actually a very nice woman, strikingly attractive woman as well, which was actually worked against her as a collector, unfortunately. She was married to a solicitor, well, a solicitor or anything in a suit is generally persona non grata when going to the travelling community. But she did her absolute level best to prove herself to the travellers, to get to that secret stream, and she did this by rolling up her sleeves and picking hops alongside of the families that she visited. She also allowed certain members of the gypsy community into her house, which once again was a double-edged sword. I mean, she was being very nice to them, she was being respectful to them, but this was the Locke family, who in fact were all great fiddle players, especially John Locke. They used to announce their arrival at her house by playing underneath her window, and she was holding a party for some of her friends and allowed them inside. But this was, of course, the male members of the family, which didn't go down wildly well with the female members of the family, who were a little bit upset by this. Understandably, Mrs. Locke, John's wife, wanted to know what on earth her husband was doing with the alluring Mrs. Leather, and proceeded to make a visit to Mrs. Leather's house, knock on the door and say, "Can I have a word with the mistress of this house?" To which the maid replied, "No, you can't, she's resting," which didn't go down at all well. As a result of this, she asked for a sheet of paper. That's Mrs. Locke asked for a sheet of paper, and the maid thought she's going to write a note. Well, Mrs. Locke was probably illiterate, but what she actually did was tear the paper into very small pieces, put 4 pieces, north, south, east and west, in the basket she was holding, and then put the rest with various ritual mumbles over her windowsills and down on the doorstep as well, and walk away, which this is a form of cursing. Effectively, I'm going to tell you how to put a gypsy curse on now. What you need to do is to get hold of something that belongs to the individual who is to be disrespected, and then you have to impregnate it with your will and then bury it or put it on their property. And so, of course, the maid was absolutely terrified. But more interestingly and more importantly, Ella Leather, you try saying that this time of the day, was then collecting with Ralph Vaughan Williams in a very hostile environment. Those women wanted nothing to do with her, and whilst the men sang some very interesting songs, excellent songs, including the wonderful version of The Blacksmith that we're familiar with, the women would only sing carols. And once again, she, although she meant she meant well, she never got near that secret stream of songs. However, what I will do is let Mrs. Leather take up the narrative on that. When she went to visit the Jones family, and this was in Weebley in Herefordshire, we all sat down upon upturned buckets, kindly provided for us by the gypsies, while Dr. Vaughan Williams noted down the tunes, his wife and I noted down alternate lines of the words. It's difficult to convey to those who've never known it the joy of hearing folk songs as we heard that ballad, the difference between hearing it there and in a drawing room or in a concert hall. It's just that between discovering a wild flower growing in its native habitat and admiring it when transplanted into a botanical garden. Well, there we have it, don't we? In my experience, which is quite extensive, travellers don't much like being referred to as unlettered savages or botanical flowers. See, that social gap was very wide, and she never really managed to bridge it. It wasn't helped by Ralph Vaughan Williams, who, well, I'll let him take up the narrative. It was a cold, clear September night, and we were by the blazing fire in the open ground of the gypsy encampments. The fire had been specially lighted to enable us to note down the words and tunes in the growing darkness. Then out of the half-light came a beautiful tenor voice, singing The Unquiet Grave. Well, that voice belonged to Mr. Alfred Price Jones, but the attitude, once again, sorry, but the fire wasn't lit because of Ralph Vaughan Williams was coming. The fire was lit so they could actually cook some food to feed their kids. So once again, the attitude and the gap is there to get to that secret stream. Well, I'm glad they made the effort, and they did get some excellent songs. In actual fact, we have a word about Ralph Vaughan Williams. He couldn't be bothered to write down the names of any of his gypsy informants that night. He actually wrote down on the top of each tune, gypsy, spelt depressingly with a lowercase g, and then in the corner of his manuscript he wrote at a 45-degree angle Mrs. Leather's tunes. So it's been quite a difficulty of matching up which tune we sung to which song by which singer, because he didn't actually bother to put in any information like a time signature or even a key signature, so you had to try and work it out. And then under some of the other tunes he scribbled tune doubtful. So it's been a bit of a detective attempt to get things back together again. Well, let me just be a little bit more positive about it. I am so glad that they did collect the songs, and in actual fact, with all the other couple of collectors I'm coming to, I will give you a number. In fact, they were, when I find it, never mind, I think there was between 40 to 50 different singers and 170 songs, and that I think is quite an achievement. Yes, I have got that right. Well, a quick word about George Gardner. He did an excellent job, and I mean he did an excellent job in the New Forest in Hampshire. I really do think his whole attitude generally was laudable. The stories about him, the way he dealt with his informants, the way he approached them, gypsies or otherwise, and the respect he gave them. He was a very nice man. And he collected from two important gypsy families, or one was Albert Doe, who sang the famous Flower of Serving Men, and that's lovely. He got them all down, the songs that he sang. I think there's about 10 or 12 songs from Albert Doe, but very interestingly, the Cole family. And the Cole family all sang, all of them. The matriarch was Jane Cole, and he had a son, Albert, no, sorry, that wasn't him, William, and also a daughter, Jessie, and a gentleman by the name that we didn't know the name of until fairly recently, who sang the Oakham Poachers. I'm sure you're very familiar with the Oakham Poachers. And his name was Mr. G. Cole. Well, I found out to my delight that G stood for Goliath. So his name was Goliath Cole. In actual fact, there was a photograph of him. I actually found a photograph online. The Cole family became quite respectable by about 1920, 1930. As you can see, Goliath Cole had moved into a house from the tent in the New Forest. That's his wife Julia there. And he's quite a large bloke, but he wasn't wildly keen on being called Goliath. And so he changed his name to Gilbert. And Gilbert was renamed by the gypsy family as Gilly Cole. Now, Gilly Cole, that's interesting because it brings me on quickly to the next part of this talk. Gilly is the gypsy word for singer. So a Gilly is a singer. Singer Cole. Yeah, great. Well, it brings me on to songs that were collected in the Anglo-Romani language. And Cecil Sharpe comes out ahead of everybody on this. He did a sterling job. Okay, he only collected one song, but it was a very interesting one. He was in Baxter in Somerset when he visited Tom Stanley. He visited the Stanley family, and he got a song which was actually a tuning. Now, I'm sure some of you know what I mean by a tuning, but it is really a dance, a tune that you can actually dance to. So there'll be some words, and then there will be some mouth music, which you are allowed to step dance to if there's no instrument about to play that tune. So the words are usually really secondary to the tune and don't usually mean a lot. But he got Rockadown Romanish, and he got that from Tom Stanley. And the first line, because this is important about collecting songs from travellers, sums it up in one line, in a few words, the problems that you can actually get with working in the Anglo-Romani language. And I should say Anglo-Romani cant, because this is the first line. Rockadown Romanish, fake to the bosh. Okay. Rocker, that means speak. Rockadown Romanish means keep your voice down Romani. Okay. Fake to the bosh. Well, it's the bosh is a violin, a fiddle, and that's quite well known outside the gypsy community. But the word fake really sums up the problems. The word fake means several things in Romani and a couple of things in cant, and so it's a word that actually needs to be in context. I will tell you the context now of this, and that is fake to the bosh. It's a slang word for dance. So it's keep your voice down Romani and dance to the fiddle. And the reason for that is the song goes on to say there's a right good box of tools over there. The bloke is watching me at the moment, and I'm trying to get my hands on them. So, and then it goes on to say, if you could send one of the women round to tell his fortune, tell him to give me the tools, and then I'll be a big dealing man. That's the gist of it, but it's all in rhyme, together with a step dance, you see. So, Rockadown Romanish, fake to the bush. But fake, or fake or a faker, we know in nowadays we talk about a fake meaning something that's been dishonestly produced or copied. Whereas if you were to consult, what's the book name? This one, the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, there it is. You will find, this was from 1811, you'll find the word fake in there is referring to somebody who is a member of the canting crew and earns his living by various dishonest means. Within the Romani community and within the travelling community, fake or a faker was basically the same as saying scallywag in today's terminology. And so there is a version of Mandy Went to Prove the Gry where there's a line in it, Av Romani faker, meaning come along my Romani rogue. So that means you've got 3 or 4 different meanings to the same word, which brings me on to poor old Alice Gillington. Now, Alice Gillington was a rather complex character. She decided that she wished to live a Romani life, and here she is, caravans. They're not a very good photograph, but I can tell you right now that the caravan in the front there was actually worth a bob or two. It was built in Chertsey on Chertsey Underworks, and it's a Chertsey wagon. Nowadays that wagon would be worth in the region of £25,000 to £30,000. I actually painted one some time ago, so I know. The wagon behind it was her brother, and there's no means of heating in that wagon, so the sort of life it must have been in the winter, I don't know. You can see they've also got a bender tent up. But anyway, Alice Gillington, getting back to the point, she lived with the travellers, but then she, when it suited her, she moved away from the travellers to find her own encampment, as we can see from this photograph. And she did make a brave attempt to collect some of the Romani songs and tunes that were given to her. This was a family that was probably based in Sussex, although she would have them that in her book, which was called Songs of the Open Road, that they were actually in Hampshire. And I will give you another example of where she, what I say went wrong is too harsh, because I've gone wrong myself when it comes to speaking Romani. There was a version of Mandy went to prove the grave, which means I went to put the horse in the field. And the general story is that I had a battle with a policeman and then disappeared off and spent the night in the barn, but I'm going away with my Romani girlfriend, so he can't get me. That's what the song basically says. But it brings me on to something I think you'll be interested in, and that's the fact that the travellers have words which, number one, are archaic and not in use in this day, but also words that are not spoken. Now, you have to bear in mind that I'm married to a Romani gypsy, and I'm not going to speak the words because they're considered to be bad luck, but I will tell you what they are. The first and most bad luck you can get from speaking the word for a primate, M-O-N-K-E-Y, you would not use that word. You'd use the word jasper instead. And the larger of the rodents, R-A-T, you would not use that either. You would have called them long boys, or you'd call them ringtails, because it's considered to be bad luck. Well, so is the word for snake, but that's not really in this day and age. The word for a snake is sap, but it's still considered to be a bit of a rude word, and it's more like an expletive, like we'd say damn. So the chorus that Alice Gillington wrote down without knowing what it was sap me dirry datchin. Sap me dirry datchin, can't the mush cur well, which actually means sap, damn, my dear father. Datchin is a very, very old word for father. It's not used now. They'd used dadress. And can't the mush cur well, can't the policeman fight well. Okay, so that sort of thing you're up against. Plus, even simple words like for a word for a woman, juvel, sorry, mort rackley. Okay, well all of those mean woman, but in modern parlance, they'd use the word bewer, which is a word that is really like me in South London. We'd say that's a nice looking bird. Okay, so so once again, anybody learning the language, well, birds fly about and lie down in trees, you see. So that's the confusion. The other one, and please no disrespect to anybody at all, that the juv is actually nowadays the Romani word for a louse. It really is. So a juva or a juvie is a louse, an active citizen, as they used to say. So poor Alice Gillington and Mr. Cecil Sharpe were up all of this
Sorry to leap in.
attempting to play the song.
Sorry to leap in, Nick, but you
Sorry?
have to start winding up. We are running out now.
Well, actually I can stop there, because all I was going to say really after that was that George Borrow made an attempt to produce the Romani Lavo Lil with all the words in there, but he was more really interested. 1803 to 81, he was a very egotistical man. He wrote poems about how wonderful he was. I will not read you one. But to give you an example, he also wrote songs that he allegedly collected from the Romani people. I'm going to have to reflect them in the book. But let me just tell you now, there's one called the Romani Love Song, which in English is, I choose as pillows for my head those snow-white breasts of thine, which he translated into Romani as Pawnee Burke's Men Angry Will Be, which actually means water breasts my neck thing will be, which is worse than McGonagall, isn't it? So in other words, you're up against this complete mess that you have to sort out. But for all of that, 37 to 40 singers, 170 songs, the secret stream is still flowing. The waters might be a bit muddied, but I'm doing my best with both of these books to clear the waters a little bit, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Nick, for giving us a real insight into something a lot of us know nothing about. And can you put the titles of your books in the chat. That would be really useful.
Oh yeah.
And I must
Hopefully
say,
they will be out middle of this year.
brilliant.
Hopefully.
That's brilliant. I must say to you that where I live in Cumbria, my local town, its very specific dialect includes a lot of Romani words, and women were always morts round here. Morts and gadgies, chavers, everything's.
Well, that's men. That's men. That's 2 words for men.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Ducal dog was a Jew. Anyway, that aside, are there any questions? Yes, Brian Peters. Brian Peters, please.
Thank you, Nick. That was absolutely fascinating. I was glad to see that you brought Cecil Sharpe into it, having read in an expensively produced book from the USA that Sharpe had willfully ignored traveller singers. I encourage anybody here who's not seen them already to take a look at Sharpe's photographs of Betsy Holland and her family and her children inside the Bender tent, which are all at the Vaughan Williams Library site, and note in passing that he said that she had produced the finest piece of folk singing that he'd ever heard. And just one little question at the end of all that. I once read a letter that Sharpe had written in which he said he was just about to head off to the Forest of Dean to collect songs from gypsies, which I never followed up. So I wondered if you've got any evidence that he did that.
No, he didn't do it, to my knowledge. But I say that, I'll have a look now you mentioned it, Brian, and see what I can come up with.
Okay.
That would be a really new piece of research. Are there any other questions in any hands up? No, they're not that I can see. I think we might have to wind it up there because we're already over time, in which case I'd just like to say thank you to all our wonderful guests this afternoon, to Nick, to John and to Paul. So big round of applause to everyone for this second Folk Voice Conference. And back to Steve Ryle.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you again to all the speakers and to everybody who joined us today. I've never been called a paradigm before, so I will have to go and look that up to find out what it means. But I hope you're all going to join us again next Sunday for part 3 for 4 wonderful papers from wonderful speakers. So thanks for joining us. And unless Martin's got to say anything. Martin, do you need anything?
No, that'll be fine, Steve. Everything seems to have worked this time, so good.
In the end. Yeah, that's great. All right, thanks very much for coming, everybody. See you next week.